Good afternoon, and welcome to another in the longest and most extended lecture series in the history of CEU. Rethinking Open Society never quits. We just go on and on with one more extraordinary talk after another. In part, let's be frank, because of our situation, many wonderful people have actually volunteered to talk, and today is an example of that. Just a couple of very brief announcements. The first is that Steve Walt, who I'll introduce in just a minute, will be giving not just one talk, but two talks here. One especially to perhaps to doctoral candidates, but possibly to everybody in this room. The talk is wonderfully titled. It's called Being an Academic in the 21st Century. And it's going to be on Wednesday, May the 31st, between 3:30 and 5:10. And I think you can find it on the CEU website, but I wanted to signal that. I think it's particularly targeted at our doctoral students. No one has a more unvarnished and realistic view of academic life in the 21st century than this guy. So that's one good thing. Second announcement is that the last of this series, Rethinking Open Society, for this semester, although we will be back next semester, is a very special lecture by Robert Kaplan, one of the great public intellectuals who thinks about international affairs and international relations. And he will be talking again here, but not at the usual 5:30 time, at 11 a.m. on Wednesday. 11 a.m. on Wednesday, Robert Kaplan will be talking about Eurasia, Europe, and the question of U.S. leadership. And now let me just introduce Steve Walt. I think, as everybody knows, this is Steve Walt is, I think, the preeminent realist in the practice and theory of international relations in the United States. He is a towering figure in the theory of international relations. Because he and I have been colleagues at the Kennedy School of Government for many years, I also know that he's one of a rare kind of realist that is a compassionate realist, a person with a very strong sense of both the extreme advantages of realism in getting great states to think clearly what their national interests are, but he's never been a realist to exclude the need for values, for compassion, for solidarity with people in desperate circumstances. But he asks, and it has been a great lesson to me as a colleague and friend, he asks every one of us who is more liberal internationalists in their persuasions to discipline emotion, to discipline ethics, to discipline compassion, with a sense of unintended harms, with a sense of consequences, and always with a clear and and lucid sense of reality. I think the strongest thing I would take from Steve's work is a simple thing. A realist is someone who wants to base the policy of great states not on what they wish were true, but what they know to be true about reality in all its harshness and complexity and difficulty. And that is something I've learned from him personally. I've also, if I just go on for one more minute, known him as a colleague. And one of the things that you learn about a colleague, and this is germane to being an academic in the 21st century, is you quickly discover from a colleague what kind of citizen they are in the community you're a part of. And all I can say without going into detail, this man is one of the best academic citizens I've ever met. He shows up. He does the work. He serves his students. One of his students is here today, obviously because of the loyalty and affection that he has generated among students. These are the tests of virtue that in Steve that I've learned to respect and admire. And I want us all to give him a very warm welcome. He's going to speak about open societies at home and abroad. Our meeting will go on until 7 p.m. and then there'll be refreshments afterwards. Steve, welcome to CEU.
Thank you very much. Very generous. It is a real pleasure to be back here at CEU. I want to thank Michael for the very kind introduction. Please, and thank all of you for coming. This university, if I may start this way, is a remarkable institution of which its founder, its president, its faculty, its students, and all of Hungary should be proud. More than anything else, human progress is due to the accumulation of knowledge and the creation of institutions to manage political differences. And CEU is a place that produces knowledge we need and a place where important ideas can be discussed, debated, and improved. Europe, and especially Hungary, would be much the poorer if this institution were not here. Now, great universities reflect a certain set of liberal ideas, and it's those ideas I'm going to talk about at length today. As Michael said, I'm known as a realist in academic circles, and realists are often accused of being hostile to, or at least skeptical of, liberal notions. But I'm going to approach those notions today from a critical but rather sympathetic perspective and try to separate out the positive elements of the liberal vision from some of its unintended negative consequences. So to do that, I'm going to start by talking about the optimism of the 1990s and the realities of 2017. I'll then say what I think liberalism is and explain why it is in fact such an attractive model for organizing domestic society. I'm then going to talk about how that model has gone wrong in recent years, focusing mostly, but not entirely, on its international consequences. And I'm going to close with a few suggestions on what we ought to do about it now. So if you look back, the 1990s were really the high watermark of liberal optimism. The collapse of communism, the Velvet Revolutions in Eastern Europe convinced lots of smart people that liberal democratic orders were the only viable model for human society. Francis Fukuyama, as we all know, famously wrote that these grand ideological struggles were behind us. We had reached the end of history. There was no longer going to be any need for generals, heroes, or great leaders. All that really was left was economic activity. Not to be outdone, Thomas Friedman of the New York Times spent the 1990s arguing globalization was forcing all countries to put on the golden straitjacket and embrace the liberal model: democracy, market economies, rule of law, membership in key global institutions. And all of this, he told us, would supposedly lead to unprecedented prosperity. Here in Europe, the EU was expanding and deepening, creating a common currency. Some even saw it as an alternative model to the United States, one based on civilian power and law rather than military dominance. In the United States, the Clinton administration committed itself to enlarging the sphere of democratic rule. U.S. leaders and foreign policy experts thought the tide of history was running their way. Liberal principles would be easy to spread, peacefully if possible, but if necessary, using military force. And a few dictators might hold out for a while, but eventually all of the other major powers, including Russia and China, would embrace the liberal model. Or so they thought. Liberals also believed it was time for global institutions to play a bigger role, especially in defending human rights. This impulse produced proposals such as the Responsibility to Protect doctrine, which called for foreign intervention to protect citizens whose own governments were unwilling or unable to do so. In short, in the 1990s, lots of thoughtful people believed the world was poised for an unprecedented era of peace and prosperity based on an expanding liberal world order, all under the benevolent leadership of the United States. So what happened? Well, we've seen Russia has reverted back towards autocracy. NATO expansion poisoned that relationship, helped trigger the Ukraine crisis. China's market-oriented one-party state proved surprisingly resilient. Globalization lifted millions out of poverty, especially in Asia, but had disruptive economic, social effects elsewhere. Turkey, Israel, Poland, and yes, Hungary have all moved in illiberal directions in recent years. And according to Larry Diamond of Stanford University, between 2000 and 2015, democracy broke down in 27 countries, while existing authoritarian regimes became less open, less transparent, and less responsive to their citizens. Efforts to build workable democracies in Iraq and Afghanistan failed. The Arab Spring quickly turned into the Arab Winter. Since 2008, the European Union has been mired in a prolonged economic and political crisis, culminating in Britain's decision to leave the Union last year. And my own country has seen the election of Donald Trump, a man whose commitment to liberal principles is paper thin and whose actions may yet trigger a constitutional crisis. The past 25 years, in short, has not been kind to the liberal project. Now, I may be a realist, but I do not, in fact, take any pleasure in saying that. And that's because the liberal vision actually has a great deal to commend it. Liberalism, just to think about that for a second, was a revolutionary development in political philosophy. And we often forget how original it was back when it first emerged. It arose in response to the prevailing political forms in 17th century Europe, a period of recurring religious and civil wars, and those conflicts raised fundamental questions about the relationship between religion and government and the legitimacy of absolutist or authoritarian rule. Liberalism begins with the claim that all humans have certain natural rights which should not be infringed. Liberalism stresses the role of human reason, which liberals see as the main engine of human progress. Political arrangements can be created and refined and improved by reasoned debate, which means politics can become more and more effective, equitable, and progressive over time. Because all humans have rights, liberals believe they should be free to pursue their individual ends, provided they don't harm others. So liberals tend to emphasize tolerance and want to keep personal choices, like religion, outside the political sphere. Finally, for liberals, the legitimacy of any government depends on the consent of the governed. In practice, this requires not just holding an election, but also requires free speech, representative institutions, leaders that are accountable to their citizens, and a legal order that is administered in a politically neutral fashion. Now, notice everything I just said is about domestic affairs, not about foreign policy. And notice also that these ideas are intrinsically very appealing. It says people should have rights that ought to be protected. Leaders should not have unchecked power. Certain behavior, torture, the slaughter of innocents, throwing people in jail for no reason, are morally wrong and should not be permitted under any circumstances. And this vision also implies that the world would be better off if relations between countries, including the conduct of war, were regulated in various ways by law and norms. At first glance, this is a much more appealing vision than, say, the realist view of politics, which tends to emphasize conflict, rivalry, and suspicion. I'd add one more thing here, and it's important. Liberal societies have a pretty good track record at home. On average, their economic performance is much better than most authoritarian states. Liberal societies are less likely to commit mass killings or other human rights violations. And when liberal states make mistakes, as all countries do, they're usually quicker to figure it out and take corrective action. Liberal states have better human rights records at home, longer life expectancies, higher rates of education. And interestingly, they don't engage in fratricidal quarrels with each other. Because when you think about it, liberalism rests on the principle that one open society doesn't get to tell another open society how to run its own internal affairs. The Soviet Union and Communist China nearly went to war over the proper way to interpret Marx and Lenin. Liberal states do not threaten to go to war over the right way to read Locke or Madison or Montesquieu. Most importantly, liberalism prizes the free flow of information, of ideas, of culture, and commerce. Open societies don't just tolerate differences within, they are open to the world. And over the past 200 years, no country has done better off by shutting itself off from others, by stifling the free expression of ideas, by censoring the academic, scientific, and intellectual community. Soviet Union did modernize under communism, but the price was enormous. It would have done even better with a more open economy and society. China, under Mao Zedong, suffered man-made famines, internal convulsions, and had a per capita income when he died of less than $300. China is not democratic today, but it is much more open and much more successful. And it's also worth noting that some of the obvious authoritarian success stories, such as Singapore or South Korea, have either relaxed their once rigid orders or become fully democratic. So as a blueprint for organizing a country, the liberal vision has a lot going for it. And as Churchill famously said, it's the worst form of government except for all the others. But if that's true, then how do we explain the setbacks of the past 25 years, and especially the last 2 years? I think there were 5 things that went wrong. The first error is the one that the gods warned us against, hubris, and it took several forms. Here in Europe, I think the obvious mistake was the creation of the euro, a rash act undertaken even though economists from across the political spectrum warned that it ultimately would not work without stronger political institutions and a common fiscal policy. European leaders and publics also failed to recognize that continued expansion of the Union would gradually make it so heterogeneous that it would not be able to function well and make it harder to reach collective decisions, ultimately undermining the legitimacy of the entire project. In the United States, hubris took the form of an aggressive effort to remake the world in America's image through a policy of liberal hegemony. And as my friend John Mearsheimer explains in an important forthcoming book, powerful liberal states have a tendency to become crusaders, to export their principles wherever and whenever they can. And when you think about it, that's not surprising, because if all human beings have basic rights, then logically those rights apply everywhere there are humans, and all humans should have them too. It's that impulse that led to the invasion of Iraq, to support for regime change elsewhere in the Middle East, to the failed state in Libya, to the endless war in Afghanistan, and it has contributed to the tragic conflict in Syria and, of course, the refugee crisis here in Europe. With the best of intentions, liberals have done a lot of damage over the past 25 years. Now, let me just reflect on that for a minute. Trying to spread liberalism abroad fails for 2 important reasons. By definition, spreading liberalism means regime change, and threatening non-liberal states with regime change encourages them to do whatever they can to prevent it, such as pursuing weapons of mass destruction or possibly seizing Crimea. Second, we don't know how to create liberal orders once the old regime is gone. That's not surprising when you think about it, because liberalism took several centuries to create in the West, and it was a bloody and contentious process. To assume the United States or others could topple governments and expect a stable liberal order to emerge in these places that had never known it before was frankly delusional. Instead, the results have been failed states, a greater risk of terrorism, and note what that causes. It leads liberal states to conduct targeted killings, drone strikes, increased government surveillance at home. Trying to spread democracy abroad can endanger it in our own societies. So the first mistake was hubris. The second big error was assuming that economic globalization would be uniformly beneficial and would not produce a powerful political backlash. I think globalization has had many positive effects. It made many goods cheaper. It helped lift billions of people out of poverty around the world. But in advanced economies, Wall Street did better than Main Street did. Economic inequality rose dramatically. And globalization, as it was implemented, made the international financial system much more fragile, as we learned when the American housing market collapsed in 2008 and triggered a global recession. Also, liberalism privileges the individual. and modern liberalism celebrates the market. The underlying message is one of pure self-interest. We should all strive to get rich, think first and foremost about ourselves. Unfortunately, I think this attitude, this message, reinforces the belief that we're really all out for number one, and anyone who sacrifices for the community is either naive or a fool. It's this ethos that underpins that inequality today, and of course, the gleeful greed of someone like Donald Trump. The third error was the tendency for these same elites throughout the liberal order to insulate themselves from accountability. No matter how badly they led, how corrupt they became, leaders and officials throughout the West seemed to get away scot-free. In the United States, none of the bankers who created the financial crisis were ever prosecuted or even properly investigated. And when Hillary Clinton ran for president, the perception that she was too close to Wall Street was clearly a major liability. The architects of the disaster in Iraq either moved on to new positions or landed in safe sinecures, and most of them never apologized for it. In Europe, elites like Tony Blair, David Cameron, François Fillon, and others all seemed increasingly out of touch and unconnected from ordinary people. The loudest defenders of the liberal order were doing just fine, but they forgot that others were not. Now, by the way, to be clear, I am not saying that leaders in the liberal world have been worse than other leaders in other places, but remember, they're supposed to be better. Fourth, the liberal order is in trouble because its advocates forgot about nationalism. Writing in 1999, liberal writers John Eikenberry and Daniel Dudney argued that there was a growing civic identity in the West that was supplanting traditional national loyalties. Here's what they wrote, quote, "As civic and capitalist identities have strengthened, ethnic and national identity has declined. Although it is still customary to speak of the West as being constituted by nation states, the political identity of Westerners is no longer exclusively centered on nationalism." Now, this idea is, of course, the dream of European integration, but I think the events of the past decade has shown that they were at best premature. In every corner of the world, nationalism and other forms of local identity are surprisingly durable. We see this in the Brexit vote, the suspicion of immigrants, the often fierce resistance to foreign interference in Afghanistan or the Middle East. Contrary to the cosmopolitan image of a borderless world where we are all global citizens, many people are still wary of those who are different, worried about changes that threaten their way of life, and angry when they have to take orders from either an occupying army or anonymous bureaucrats in Brussels. Now, none of this is to say that the liberal vision is wrong, but its proponents forgot that nationalism is alive and well and cannot be ignored. The final error was the liberal assumption that history was running in only one direction, and that once a liberal order was established, once an open society was created, it could never break down. Liberals assumed elected officials would be neither willing nor able to use the tools of an open society to subvert it. We should have known better. In fact, political leaders in a liberal order can be just as venal and just as addicted to power as any dictator. Liberal societies depend not just on the formal constitutional rules, but also on informal norms and restraints, what my Harvard colleague Steve Levitsky calls the soft guardrails of democracy. These norms have eroded dramatically in recent years, especially in the United States, as politicians take maximum advantage when they happen to be in power and refuse to cooperate or compromise when they're in the minority. Even in a liberal society, unscrupulous leaders can harass the press, exaggerate foreign dangers, pander to the wealthy and powerful, classify information, prosecute dissidents, pressure universities and think tanks, suppress the vote, and thus rig the political system in their own favor, even while they hold regular elections and claim to represent the population at large. Again, we have seen this happen in Turkey, in Israel, in Hungary, in Poland, in Russia, and even in the United States. when an American president under investigation fires the head of the agency doing the investigating, both the rule of law and the basic idea of accountability are in jeopardy. The implication of all of this, of these 5 errors, has been to replace the forward-looking optimism of the 1990s, or I might add, even the optimism of 2009, when Barack Obama became president, with a politics of pessimism and nostalgia. Instead of pointing toward a brighter future, political leaders today look backward toward a nostalgic, mythical past. It is Donald Trump saying he will make America great again by taking us back. It is Brexit voters yearning for an England that is independent and sovereign and homogeneous and somehow free to chart its own course. It is Vladimir Putin invoking Russian history, the Orthodox Church, and the status that Moscow once enjoyed to keep himself and his cronies in power. It's no accident that older and less educated people are most attracted to these backward-looking visions. So if you want a bit of optimism, consider that if people my age and older were not allowed to vote, there would have been no Brexit and no President Trump. The irony is, of course, it's young people who have the most to lose from these bad leaders. So, given all this, what's to be done? Let me close by offering a few suggestions on what we ought to do now. With the liberal vision under siege, how should liberals or even sympathetic realists respond? Well, first is do not abandon or dilute the liberal ideal. As I've suggested, these have many positive features, and I don't disagree with any of them as fundamental principles. Humans do have rights. Leaders should be accountable and not have absolute power. Societies work better when ideas can be debated openly and where tolerance is promoted and protected. Education, knowledge, intelligence, skepticism all work better than passionate certainty and centralized control. Just to repeat, no modern society ever improved its situation by encouraging greater ignorance or blind obedience. And for that reason alone, recent efforts to pressure and possibly destroy this institution, this wonderful university, are worse than a crime. They are a blunder. Second, even as we defend the liberal ideal, we should heed Talleyrand's other famous piece of advice: above all, not too much zeal. To defend liberalism at home, we have to be wary about trying to spread it abroad. We have to be honest with ourselves here. We don't know how to do that. And well-intentioned attempts often trigger a hostile backlash. Changing a social and political order inevitably creates winners and losers, and many unintended consequences, and especially when it's done by outsiders with little understanding of the societies they're trying to shape. With hindsight, the effort to expand the liberal world order after 1989 was too much too soon and too fast, and we are now dealing with a backlash that might have been avoided had we proceeded with greater humility. Third, we need to reaffirm our own faith in the virtues of an open society. If we generally believe that an open society is best, then we should be confident that it will, in fact, ultimately triumph, and we can be patient about it. We don't have to try and create a liberal world order overnight. As I said, liberal states have been the world's most successful over the past century or more, and if we believe their liberal, open character has been a central ingredient in that success, we should be more confident about what the future will bring. It follows, and this is my last point, that the best way to encourage the gradual and enduring spread of liberal values is to set a good example, so that people around the world will see how open societies live and will want something similar for themselves, suitably adapted to their own historical and cultural traditions. And that means that the future of open societies is, in fact, in our hands. It will not be determined by events in Afghanistan, in Moscow, in Syria, the South China Sea, or Eastern Ukraine, but rather, first and foremost, by what politicians and citizens do in their own countries, in the countries that are liberal and open today. So paradoxically, defending and strengthening liberalism at home remains the best way to promote it abroad. Thank you very much. I look forward to hearing your questions.